Hi everyone, we're going to be looking at the progressive era today, looking really at what the progressives were doing to help solve the problems of the Gilded Age. We already started this lecture a little earlier on, and you see we took notes on the muckrakers, and we also took some notes on voter reform, and we took notes on the temperance. What we're going to be doing today is focusing on women's rights, women's rights. And then we're also going to be looking at the progressive presidents of Theodore Roosevelt, Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, and what they did on the national level to help make major changes. So make sure you have your lecture guide out. We're going to be going through that and making sure you sort of fill that out as we go through. Okay, so again, the first part we're going to be going through today is the women's rights and the women's, especially the suffrage movement we're going to be focusing on today. Okay, for the suffrage movement, so the women's movement, there was lots of little parts to it, but again, the big part was women's voting rights. So we already had women's voting rights being a big part of the feminist movement that was built up from the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and going up through the Civil War and then up through the late 1800s, and then really sort of accumulating the 1900s. An organization that was created was called NAWSA, NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It was actually, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were part of this. By the time the 1900s rolled around, a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt was the president of this, and they had over 2 million members. It was a national organization that was really well funded and widespread. And another women's movement that actually formed out of NAWSA was National Women's Party, the NWP. This was founded by Alice Paul, who was actually a member of NAWSA, but wanted to take this a step farther and be even more extreme with her ideology. She wanted an immediate amendment to give women the right to vote. She wanted also an equal rights amendment for women, and she wanted to do this right now, not wait for a state-by-state election, but basically push this into Congress right away. One thing that really sort of, I guess you could say, helped the women was actually World War I. It really gave them a sense of what they were doing. They really took a big part in the role on the home front, and probably because of that, many senators saw that and then will vote to allow women to vote with the 19th Amendment that happened in 1920. It was not a widespread unanimous vote. It was barely passed. But in 1920, the 19th Amendment gained two-thirds of the Congress that voted yes to allow women suffrage. So that was really huge with the 19th Amendment. Okay, so now we're going to be going down to where it says Theodore Roosevelt and the square deal. So we're going to be looking at basically Theodore Roosevelt now and the square deal. So move your notes down to that area right there. And we're going to look at these two acts called the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act. Okay, so let me get the PowerPoint down there. Okay, before we get into those two acts, we're going to look at Roosevelt as a president. And so right under his name where it says square deal, we're going to want to write, so right under his name right there, where it says square deal, you're going to want to write some of these notes down that we have. Okay, so he was called the accidental president because the president before him was shot and killed, William McKinley. He was actually vice president to William McKinley. So he became president, in 1901, right at the very start of McKinley's term. And his deal was a square deal where basically he was going to protect both the consumer and the worker and the business owner, all sort of in the same light. He was going to give everyone a fair shot. He was going to protect those people, not just favor monopolies and just favor the business like previous presidents did. Again, so he was going to sort of be very non-laissez-faire comparatively. And you see here, he's going to be really sort of pushing to break up and control some of these large corporate trusts and monopolies that have been really controlling the economy. And so that was going to be a big part of Roosevelt's vision. Again, he was not anti-business, but he wanted to make sure that he wanted to help the public against big business, but not overstep the boundary of the presence at the same time. So again, in this box right next to Roosevelt, we're going to see what you're going to write down as a problem is these big monopolies or these big trusts. So you're going to want to write down here, what the big problem is monopolies and trust were hurting society. Okay, and there was two laws that really were built to stop these trusts hurting society. The problem is that neither of them had any presidential buy-in or a weight. They were both passed in the Gilded Age, and they were both good laws. But the problem was neither had any president buy-in, which means the president didn't enforce these laws. Now with Roosevelt, who is going to be a more activist president, we're going to see him actually enforcing these laws to break up some of these large trust monopolies. So you have the Sherman Antitrust Act that basically outlawed any combination of companies that restrain interstate trade. So that disallowed these large conglomerate companies from forming and hurting the public in multiple states. You also had the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887 that would basically regulate the shipping rates of railroads. Again, great law, it was just never enforced. So Roosevelt is going to start enforcing these laws to make sure these large train monopolies, these railroad monopolies, were not going to basically, sort of screw the public out of, and smaller shippers. And you're going to have this Sherman Act that's going to start breaking up these large monopolies. And because of that, and we're going to go to the next slide or next page for this, so we're going to go down now to this area right here, where it says Trust Buster. And Roosevelt did want to break up the bad trusts that took advantage of the market and abused their power, but regulate the good trusts. So make sure we write that down. He wanted to basically, what I would write down, he wanted to break up the bad trust and regulate the good trust. And remember, trust is just another fancy word for monopoly. And this is going to be a really famous cartoon that you're going to see where he's basically killing the bad trust, regulating the good trusts, and they're again using bears as the restraint here. And the White House being in the background. So the very first section that you see is letter C. You're going to write this down. The Northern Securities Company. Again, the problem was trusts. The problem here that we could put was monopolies. Right? And the Northern Securities Company was basically a railroad company that was in the Northwest, owned by J.P. Morgan, and it basically was a monopoly of transportation that Roosevelt wanted in. And what he did, he actually got a Supreme Court to rule against the Northern Security Companies and break up that railroad trust to allow them to be more fair in their shipping rates. And another thing that he did, in 1902, he basically sided with the miners. He sided with the unions here rather than siding with the ownership. So he was the very first president to side with a union over the ownership during a strike. So that was the first time we had that. So that's very important to know that. So basically Roosevelt, so TR sided with the miners. And he was the first president to back a union over the company. So couple big achievements were there for, I guess, for workers' laws and unions and strikes, and putting actually the power of the presidency now in the hands of the people and the workers rather than the owners and the companies. He also strengthened the ICC by increasing the power in the Hepburn Act. So he created a bill called the Hepburn Act that will strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroad rates. So again, the Hepburn Act, make sure you put down, will regulation of railroads by the federal government. And what that will is bring down shipping cost. Again, helping consumers out and helping small businesses out or small shippers out. You see him here, he's actually sort of wrestling with the railroads. And here he's sort of putting the big elephant GOP, saying for Republican Party, to stop the railroads there. Okay, then he creates the Pure Food and Drug Act to regulate the food and drug industry to make sure that the consumers are gaining more confidence in the food and the drugs and the products they put in their bodies. So basically, again, the big problem we see here, move this down here. The problem there was basically, consumers had no protections against food and drug products. They didn't know what was in the good. They didn't know, again, if it's any type of drugs, was it healthy for you? Was it unhealthy? Were the things that the drug companies were putting out actually something that was toxic, or was this was the cures very good? So that was huge. He was able to basically deal with this where it was now going to be regulated. So you have this where basically the food and drug industries and it'll be regulated by the federal government. Okay, the next one we were sort of talked about was the Meat Inspection Act. In 1907, he's going to start regulating the meat packing plants with all the disease and bad meat that had come out because of the jungle. He was going to pass this, so we're going to see government inspectors start basically putting limits on and security checks on all the meat packing plants. So the food coming out to the consumers now was now going to be safe without this bad sausage and meat that was now flooding the market before that. You can see some great cartoons here. We see him right there, sort of threatening to shoot down the beef truck if it doesn't come down on its own. You see the Congress with the White House, the Congress building in the background there. You see Roosevelt right there controlling his secretaries to basically break up these large trusts. You see Roosevelt here, he's the youngest president. He's portrayed as a baby, breaking up both J.P. Morgan's trust and Rockefeller's trust. And here, there, him as a lion tamer. You see the beef trust here, the oil trust, the steel trust. You see Wall Street there, coming in and trying to, he's going to regulate these lions. There's Roosevelt. He's on top of the buck and bronco trying to tame this wild horse. And here's my favorite one, is that you see these Sherman antitrust laws sort of chopping down these trusts. And Roosevelt saying, no, don't chop these down, because you see here, this is a healthy tree, a healthy monopoly. So he was not really a true trust buster, because he did want to save the trusts that were working well with the government. Okay, next section. You have the conservation and preservation. He was an avid outdoorsman, and he wanted to use nature. He wanted to farm it and mine it and lumber it, but he wanted to make sure that it was safe for future generations as well. So he wanted to conserve the forests. So he created the National Forest Service so the government could manage who could use the forest. Again, this did not stop people from developing mines and logging and hunting in the forest. It just put the government in charge to regulate that, which is really important. He's also going to expand the national park system, which will preserve forest lands. And we'll talk about that, the difference between conservation and preservation, a little bit in class on Tuesday. And because of that, you see that his face was one of the faces that's going to be put on Mount Rushmore because his connection with the environment here. And there's him in front of Yosemite Falls with this famous naturalist, John Muir. Again, him with John Muir in front of the big trees in Sequoia National Park, one of our very first national parks, way back when Grant allocated this as a national park, did that in Yellowstone. Okay, Roosevelt leaves after 7 years in office, and we see now William Howard Taft being his hand-picked successor. And he's going to be very similar to Roosevelt, but a little less progressive. And you see he wins pretty easily. He basically sweeps all the North with basically brought the other the Democrat winning the South. And we see here Roosevelt walking out of the White House, giving Taft his domestic policies, taking with him his foreign policies. Okay, don't worry about this. This is something more for AP. We're not going to really worry about this Payne-Aldrich tariff. Okay, one thing that Taft does do is create the Children's Bureau to basically help cut down child labor. So in this, obviously, we're going to see, child labor is going to be a problem. And what the Children's Bureau did, it formed government commissions to regulate labor. However, though, the child labor was really still up to the states. And what eventually will probably put a stop to child labor more so than these laws was states to make so really what really more ends child labor more so than these laws is that states are going to make compulsory education something that's necessary. They're going to make it so kids have to go to school. Another thing during Taft's term is something called Muller versus Oregon. It was an Oregon law that upheld a law limiting a 10-hour workday for women. So it basically limited employers from making their women work more than 10 hours a day. Okay, in the election of 1912, we're going to see three people run against each other. Roosevelt is going to come back in to run, again. Taft is going to still want to run it well. So what Roosevelt happens is that Roosevelt thinks that Taft is not being progressive enough. He thinks that he's sort of ruining Roosevelt's legacy. So Roosevelt's going to come in and try to win the Republicans over. However, the conservative Republicans want Taft. So basically, Roosevelt's going to come up and make his own party called the Bull Moose Party. So we're going to have the Bull Moose Party with Roosevelt, and we're going to see Taft take the Republican seat. So you see here, you see Taft and Roosevelt arguing and fighting over that Republican ticket, and it'll actually be Taft who wins out. So in the political zoo, you're going to see basically the Democrats are going to elect Wilson, you see the Republicans are elect Taft, and then you see Roosevelt as that third-party candidate here. So in this election, you see Roosevelt being the Bull Moose Party, Taft being the Republican Party, and Wilson being the Democrat Party, with Roosevelt and Taft being very similar in their ideology. So you see here, we see Wilson the Democrats, and see Taft the Republicans, and you see Roosevelt is actually hurting the Republicans, making them going slower because they're more similar. Same thing here. You see there is the Bull Moose Party with Roosevelt, and you see him eating the Republican oats, which is, you could say, people or votes. And you see here Wilson wins pretty much across America. Electoral vote, he sweeps it, but look at the popular vote. He only wins 42% of the popular vote, an extremely low number. If you look at Taft and Roosevelt, if you add up their numbers, that's 50% of the vote, meaning that if only one of them had probably ran, they would have beat Wilson easily. But Wilson became the president. He is actually one of our most racist presidents of all time. We'll talk about that a little bit as well in future chapters. So Woodrow Wilson, but he also has some good qualities too. So again, there's some really bad quality about his racism and his view on ethnicity. But again, he has some really good qualities too when it comes to his economy and his progressiveness when it comes to like how he deals with economic progressiveness. Okay, so with him, the New Freedom, he was an extremely, extremely progressive president. The New Freedom was basically he wanted to destroy all monopolies. There was no good monopolies in his name. And he was very progressive. If you're going to put one person as a trust buster, most likely Wilson was going to be the person that was going to be the most trust buster of any of them. Okay, two really big things that he did that was really, really important. First, you could say he created the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. What that's going to do, that's going to basically create this national bank that's going to control interest rates and really stabilize the economy. It's going to sort of control the circulation of money, and it's going to really sort of make our federal government really have a great connection on the economy. The second thing he's going to do that was land sweeping important was create something called the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which is going to create the Federal Trade Commission. And what that's going to do is really destroy the last remaining trust that was around still. It's going to really strengthen the controls that Wilson and the government had on trusts. Okay, that is the Progressive Era lecture. Please take notes on that. Please do the summary at the very bottom of this lecture notes there. So you see the very bottom. Please do a summary about what major changes did the progressives do, or what major things did the progressives do to make changes in America because of their actions, both governmental actions and also social actions. So again, what were the major things that progressives did to make changes in society during this time period? That's what you're going to focus on. Okay, have a great day, guys, and we'll see you guys next class.